Welcome, everyone, to our panel discussion on what's next after the U.S. inauguration, trends and predictions in U.S. foreign policy, sponsored by Chatham House, the UCL Center on U.S. Politics, and the U.S. Embassy in London. This is also the last event in a series hosted by the UCL Center on U.S. Politics on the 2020 presidential election. My name is Jonathan Monton, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion. For those of you tuning in, you probably don't need to be reminded that tomorrow Joe Biden will be inaugurated the 46th president of the United States. You also probably don't need to be reminded that it's been a pretty eventful 4 years in American foreign policy, even an eventful last 2 weeks. We've assembled an outstanding panel of speakers to share their thoughts on the direction of US foreign policy, what direction it's likely to take in the next 4 years. So for tonight's discussion, we've posed to our panelists a simple question. What should we expect from US foreign policy over the next 4 years? We've asked them to speak for about 5 minutes on what to expect. And then after that, we'll have about an hour for our panelists to field questions from the audience, from all you out there from countries near and far. So it is a real privilege for me to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to do that in the order that we've asked them to speak. First, we have Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri. She is the director of the US and the Americas program and dean of the Queen Elizabeth II Academy for Leadership in International Affairs at Chatham House, and also a reader in international relations at SOAS London. Second, we have Professor Peter Trubowitz, who is a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and the US Center at the LSE. Third, we have Professor Kelly M. Greenhill. She is a professor of political science and international relations at Tufts University and a research fellow at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. For this year, she is also a Lieberhuhn visiting professor in international relations at SOAS. Fourth, we have Joseph C. Sternberg, who is the editorial page editor and political economics columnist for the Wall Street Journal's European edition. Fifth, we have Patrick Steele, who is the chief executive officer of Politico, based in the United States. Two final points before I turn this over to our panelists. First, for the participants and anyone joining us, I'd like to remind you that this is on the record and being recorded. Second, for the audience, I'd like to ask that if you have a question, please submit it in writing. And if you are willing, please include your name and affiliation so we know who we are speaking with. So without further delay, I'd like to turn the screen over to Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I should start by saying, first of all, it is a really big pleasure and honor to be collaborating with the University College London's US Center, which I have to say, talk about starting with a big, fabulous bang. I am following all of your work. It is really, I mean, we're learning lessons and we're taking notes, Jonathan. So well done to you, to Julie Norman, to Thomas Gift. It's just tremendous work. It's great to be on this panel co-sponsored by, I guess, ourselves and the US Embassy in London, but also with Peter Trubowitz, who sort of, led the charge on work on the US in London. And to meet some new faces, but also to see my friend and colleague, Kelly Greenhill, who will also be coming across to SOAS. So what a great panel, and I'm looking forward to learning more than talking. So let me be very brief. It has been an extraordinary 4 years. We all know this. It's been an extraordinary 4 years, especially, I would say, to be an American scholar, think tanker, living overseas, working on America, but watching it from abroad. And we all know that that carries a very funny positionality and a sense of responsibility without really being able to necessarily directly shape policy. So it's a frustrating position. And it's one that, I've lived through many different administrations on and off in the UK, but this one has been particularly interesting to live through. What am I looking for and how do I think about the transition? First of all, big picture. We all know, I think, that we've been debating for 4 years whether Trump is symptomatic of a broader change in American policy or whether he's really driving a particular kind of politics. And clearly the answer to that is complicated, and it's both. But I think one thing is for sure, which is that America's position in the world will continue to change. It's going to be very clearly negotiated and steered by the next administration, but in a much more strategic way than we've seen. But there's no going back. And I think that there's no going back for a couple of reasons. One is that America has clearly changed, not only domestically, but clearly with respect to its foreign policy. China is, it's clearly agreed, the number one foreign policy challenge. America's position towards trade is clearly a much tougher position that was already emerging when Donald Trump was elected. It was already emerging in the Democratic Party, but now that's bipartisan. So America has changed. It's much more divided. And there's obviously a very serious domestic set of factors that constrain President Biden as he takes that office tomorrow afternoon. But the world has also changed. And I think that is a significant factor. And I think for those of us living in the UK and thinking about Europe, we've seen, the debates about European strategic autonomy and European sovereignty. And so the rest of the world, while I think many of America's allies and partners are very clearly eager to watch this transition, not all, but I would argue most, there is a wariness, and it won't just be, an immediate reset of the kind that perhaps many people might like it to be. So America has changed, Europe has changed, and the world has changed. And of course, we're situated in the context of a global pandemic. So that broader structural change that has to be renegotiated is taking place in a very certain context. And I would argue, I would add one additional point to that, which I think is something that we all debate. And, there's a fear amongst some, including one of our close friends, and in Peter's case, a co-author, Charlie Kupchan, that, we're returning to the old team of liberal interventionists, and that, restoration might be a failed objective, given that the world has changed. I would argue that we underestimate the difference between Biden and Obama, even setting aside the fact that the world has changed and America has changed and Europe is now positioning itself differently. I see Biden and Obama as very different people, different presidents with different priorities. And the reason that we treat them the same is because we're comparing them to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is just, not the norm in my view. So I see, and let me use that comment to make a couple of very specific points about foreign policy, and one in particular. The thing that I'm watching that I think is very interesting, both at home and especially in foreign policy, is going to be the resurgence of a focus on values, and in particular on democracy and human rights, restoring democracy at home, not promoting democracy with military force, but certainly taking the value of democracy and human rights and injecting it right into the middle of America's foreign policy, both in terms of calling out human rights. We've seen that on the Twitter feed of Jake Sullivan, from Russia to Saudi to Yemen to Ethiopia, but also infusing questions of values into debates about technology and the balance between techno-democracies and techno-authoritarianism. So that focus on democracy and values, I think, is going to come right back up to the top of the agenda. And that's not what we saw when President Obama took office. In fact, President Obama was incredibly reluctant to talk about democracy, in part because of what he had inherited. So the second thing I would say about foreign policy is that, we like to say, I'm not sure we all agree on what it means, but we like to say, we're living in an era of geopolitical competition and China's the number one threat. And, these things are obvious and true, although they raise more questions than they perhaps answer. The thing that I think is most interesting about that is the integration of an administration that clearly will take democracy and values very, very much to heart at a time when competition with China, not only a very important rival in terms of its material power, but clearly a very alternative way of thinking about how to structure your domestic society and how to engage beyond your borders. So that confluence of geopolitical competition and a surge of values to the top of the agenda, I think, makes for a very competitive and a very intense turn in foreign policy. The final thing I'd say, and the thing that perhaps heartens me the most, is while this will be a president who's focused on the domestic, who's focused on the pandemic, on economic recovery, especially on reintegrating science into our public policy across the most important questions. I do think that the foreign policy team will be given the autonomy. It has the gravitas, it has the experience, it has the history and the relationships to do quite a lot on foreign policy, despite the fact that the president will be very much focused on the short-term, immediate, and extraordinary crises that are preoccupying so many Americans necessarily and importantly at home today. And I'll stop there because I put a lot on the table.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much. Next we have Peter Trubowitz.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. So it's good to be with everyone on the platform. I want to thank Chatham House and UCL and the U.S. Embassy for the invitation. So these are deeply unsettling times in the United States, and it's been a long time since a president was dealt a more challenging political hand than the one Joe Biden has been dealt. We all have a lot riding on how Biden performs, not just in the United States, but I think across the West. For obvious reasons, as Leslie suggested, he's going to focus laser-like on the home front to get the virus under control, rebuild the economy, and do what he can to heal the nation, I think, after 4 bruising, divisive years of Donald Trump. This is where the challenge is the greatest. This is how he's going to be judged by posterity. Did he get it done? And all of this, I think, places very sharp limits on how much political capital Biden can afford to invest in foreign policy, at least in the near term. And among other things, I think this means that he's going to have to set some foreign policy priorities and think carefully about the connection between foreign policy ends and means. And with that in mind, let me highlight 3 things that I think the Biden team will try to do on the foreign policy front, and that in many ways follow from the domestic pressures and constraints that he's facing. The first is perhaps the most obvious. It's reprioritizing America's traditional allies in Europe and Asia. Biden has talked a lot about this on the campaign trail and in interviews since the election in November. Campaign talk, of course, is often cheap talk, but I think there's every reason to take Biden here at his word. For one thing, reemphasizing America's longstanding strategic, economic, and political ties is a very clear and unambiguous way to signal that America is turning the page on the Trump era. And importantly, to put daylight between himself and Trump politically. And at a time when Biden is going to be preoccupied with domestic matters, it's also a cost-effective way to try to make progress on international issues that matter a great deal to most Americans, such as climate and human rights. And I think Biden will make a down payment on this tomorrow by rejoining the Paris Climate Treaty and ending the so-called Muslim ban. Second, I look for Biden to try to take some of the international attention off of Trump's America and refocus it on Xi Jinping's China, to get the monkey off of America's back and put it on China's. In many ways, Trump was good for Beijing. Trump took chess pieces like TPP and TTIP off the strategic chessboard. Trump played to China's strength by acting unilaterally rather than with America's many allies. And until late in his administration, Trump made life in the court of international opinion basically easier for Xi Jinping by turning a blind eye to Beijing's human rights violations. So I look for Biden to try to flip this script, if you will, by pressing Beijing on trade, investment, and human rights while jettisoning Trump's unilateralism in favor of a more coordinated approach with America's allies. Now, that's not going to be easy, as the recent EU-China agreement indicates. But I think there are strong domestic and international political incentives for Biden to move in this direction. Domestically, concerns about China have increased considerably since the start of the pandemic. Indeed, getting tough with China on trade, investment, and human rights is one of the few areas in foreign policy, as Leslie pointed out, that is ripe for bipartisan cooperation. Meanwhile, Europe is hardly of one mind on how to deal with China. The EU-China deal left many on the continent unhappy with a decision that puts profits before principle. And also popular sentiment towards China is souring in many European countries. So these cross pressures, I think, create bargaining room for Biden to work with. Last point, but not the least. I look for Biden to work much harder than Trump, and for that matter, Obama, in making foreign policy work for average Americans. In my judgment, this is the biggest challenge that he faces on the foreign policy front. You all know there was a time in America where Washington's efforts to promote international openness, institutionalized cooperation, multilateral governance enjoyed broad support at home. And that's because a broad cross-section of Americans believed correctly that it served their interests and their kids' interests. That's been lost. If Biden wants to return to some version of that world, and I really think he does, he's going to have to find a way to make what America is doing abroad pay dividends for average Americans in tangible, concrete ways. There are no magic bullets here, but there's a lot that Biden can and I think will try to do. I mean, his campaign commitment to adopt federal Buy American policies to favor domestic producers is a sensible, and politically it's a no-brainer. So he's going to do that. Investing in domestic priorities like infrastructure, education, energy to create non-tradable jobs and boost American competitiveness over the longer term, that's going to be a heavier political lift for him. Many Republicans will try to block him, but I think they've got the short end of the stick, especially if these efforts are connected to recovering from the pandemic and making America more competitive vis-a-vis China. The more Biden invests intelligently here, and I underscore the word intelligently, the more it will ease, I think, anti-globalist pressures in the United States, and frankly, boost the Democrats' electoral chances down the road. So this is political capital that is well spent, and I expect him to move hard in this direction within the next 18 months, which is really the window he has to work with. And Jonathan, I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter. And we've also, we've got some great issues on the table. We've also got some excellent questions already coming in. So for you in the audience, keep writing in questions and we will get to them after our speakers. Next, we have Professor Kelly Greenhill from Tufts University.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be part of this important event with such an august group. I guess I would endorse everything Peter has said, and that's sort of unfortunate because I had to cross off some of what I had planned to say. So same part, what he said, I'm just going to add a couple of additional points that speak to some of the other issues that I think the Biden administration would like to address, some of which have been foisted upon it by the dismal performance of the Trump administration. And then I'll spend what little time I have left, unfortunately, highlighting a few reasons why I think Biden's challenges may be even greater than those that have already been identified heretofore. And some of them, again, speak to things that Peter's already said, and also some of the very smart remarks made by Leslie. So in addition to the priorities identified by Peter, I would say that the Biden administration would also very much like to save the JCPOA, I should say the Iran deal, or something that looks like it. The timeline here is unfortunately quite short. Iran has an election of its own coming up as part of the poisoning of the chalice. The Trump administration on its way out the door, I think just today, announced some new sanctions on Iran. They can, of course, be lifted, but it'll take some time to unwind them. And Biden doesn't have a lot of time, and so that's a real challenge. We within the United States are going to be dealing for quite some time, and the full consequences of which won't be known for quite some time, of the Russian-backed, directed, call it what you will, cyber attack. We don't know what the consequences are, just how significant this attack was, but it's going to make harder Biden's plan to re-energize arms control agreements with the Russians to get the START treaty, the replacement START treaty negotiated and signed. So this is all I'm saying. Russian relations with the US are at a very low level. Chinese relations with the United States are at a very low level. US relations with Iran are at a very low level. There's also North Korea. So the Trump administration has managed to unhelpfully antagonize a number of US adversaries, as well as alienate US allies. So to reiterate some of the comments I've already made, a major thrust of the Biden administration has to be restoring relations with allies, turning down the temperature on relations with adversaries, or call them global competitors, and not simply during the next 4 years, but also trying to send signals to the world, adversaries, allies alike, and others, if anyone's still neutral, that Biden is not an aberration and a flash in the pan, and that we've turned a corner and the next president's not going to be Trump 2 or a less ham-fisted version of Trump 2. And there's a lot of concern about this. So what's to come next? Can a country realistically and in good conscience negotiate an agreement with the United States and expect it to last, or will the next administration possibly walk away and say, this treaty isn't worth the paper it's written on? So those are that's an uplifting set of challenges. I'm going to add a few more that are domestically intermingled with international. Some of them are domestic, some of them are international, some of them are, I guess you call it intermestic. And they are going to, in all cases, make Biden's job just a little bit more complicated. So one of them is high levels of generalized public anxiety and alienation. And Peter spoke to this in his comment about a foreign policy that works for all Americans. And this general level of anxiety and disillusionment, which has fed populism, is unsurprisingly exacerbated by growing inequality and heightened economic dislocation among segments of the US society. So when 1% of the world's population controls 50% of the world's wealth, that's a problem. And so in this way one can say, well, what we saw in Trump was a symptom rather than than a cause. Secondarily, and unfortunately, we see in this country and more broadly, historically low levels of trust in institutions, and particularly in this country, in government, specifically. And this started in the late 1960s with Vietnam and was made worse by Watergate, but arguably in some circles fell off a cliff after the Great Recession and has been exacerbated by Trumpian rhetoric. Couple this with a sort of tied to a general disenchantment with democracy. So in the 1930s in this country, 75% of people said it was imperative to live in a democracy. And by a few years ago, that number had fallen to 30%. So that, that's deeply problematic if one's trying to build support domestically and also, to implement one's agenda in the foreign policy sphere, build trust at home as well as abroad. Add to this, we're moving towards multipolarity again. So I'm not saying we're quite there yet, but great power rivalry is back, and is back with a flourish. Yes, China is going to be the US's major global competitor, and the US and China are the biggest two dogs on the block. But, I think we can think about the Russian cyber attack as it's Russia's way of reasserting itself, and as you're saying, we deserve a seat at the table too, and you can't ignore us. Oh, and by the way, we have a large number of strategic ballistic missiles. As has already been noted, but can't be forgotten, extraordinarily high levels of political polarization in this country, which will, at a minimum, in the context of what can be passed in Congress, make Biden's job rather more difficult. Is a consequence of the runoff elections in Georgia. The Democrats do control the Senate, but only with the tiebreaker vote of Vice President Harris. Got a combination of seismically disruptive communications technologies in the form of the internet giants who possess a non-trivial amount of control that can both help Biden, but also impede his agenda in ways that I can talk about during the Q&A, but I think we can just allude to some of the challenges of the last couple of weeks. I think that speaks to some of these issues. And Trump is leaving, but I think we're not out of the woods with regard to an unprecedented willingness of people who are elected officials or people who are in positions of power to use these technologies that have been have arisen as part of this communications revolution, to widely and unabashedly tell misleading, disinformation fraught, provide narratives that are at best misleading, but as often as not lies. And that does not seem to be going away. And that is a challenge that Biden is going to have to confront domestically. It's going to have foreign policy consequences. I don't know what to make of the most recent publicly released claims that both Russia and China have been taking advantage of domestic discord to launch additional influence operations to further inflame and fan insurrectionist tendencies here. But this is one of these issues that is both domestic and international at the same time, but I don't think it's going away. And I think I'll stop there. So I'm probably out of time. So thanks so much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Kelly's just put a few issues on the table: disinformation, polarization, inequality, insurrection, decline of social trust, collapse of democracy. Am I missing any others? I think we've got those on the table now.
There are more, but I decided to stop.
There are more, but you stop. We'll just stop there in the interest of time. There are more. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we have Joseph Sternberg from the Wall Street Journal.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. And thanks to our host for organizing this panel and inviting a lowly journalist like me to participate in it. And I'm happy to be going forth here because that gives me the luxury of just tugging away at some of the threads that Leslie and Peter and Kelly have already left hanging out there. And I want to talk a little bit less today about what I think are specific foreign policy priorities that the new Biden administration might pursue, because in my relatively limited experience on these things, what will happen is that you have an event like this on the eve of the inauguration where we all talk about what we think the new president is going to do. And then the day after the inauguration, we discover that events have had different ideas. So instead, what I'm interested in is just this question of how foreign policy is going to be made and what we actually mean when we're going to be talking about American foreign policy here. Because I think that this is something that has, in various ways dogged both the Obama and the Trump administrations. And I'm not sure that this is going to be any easier for Biden or for foreigners trying to make sense of American foreign policy if we aren't really careful about what is going on back in Washington. Because as I think Leslie and Peter and Kelly all pointed out, there's always such a strong domestic policy component to the way that foreign policy is made in America. And I think that although constitutionally and politically presidents individually have a lot of heft to set the foreign policy tone themselves, if you're asking the question, well, what is America's policy properly understood, and what are the elements of an administration's foreign policy that will have staying power, you have to look at what's going on politically in America. And so, I mean, from that perspective, to pick up on a question that Leslie put out there right at the beginning, I mean, how much was Trump symptomatic of these deeper transformations in the way American politics, was thinking about these things and where the consensus in Washington was headed, versus how much was he driving this discussion? I think that Trump was more representative of a consensus that already existed on a lot of issues, whether it was a skepticism of the Iran nuclear deal that started, back from the beginning in 2015, where there turned out not to be a strong bipartisan consensus behind that agreement. Whether it was issues like the Paris Accord and climate change, where it's been very difficult to assemble any kind of durable congressional coalition behind action on that, or even an issue like China, either Chinese trade or China's human rights abuses, where I think that administrations of both parties had kind of found their way out of what the political mainstream actually had evolved into on that. So I think that one challenge for the Biden administration is going to be figuring out how much does he, to take Peter's thought about expenditure of political capital, I mean, how much capital does Biden want to take trying to change the consensus on any of these issues versus how much is he going to end up being a product of that? And I think that on some of these things, we'll probably see that the tone will change a lot. The substance might not change very much at all. So, for example, there might be a big change in tone on climate, even to the point of rejoining the Paris Accords. But in terms of actual domestic action, what laws get changed in America that will change behavior in the American economy to align with that, you probably won't see anything different than what we've seen in previous administrations. So, I mean, I round out with a quick observation then about how foreign audiences in particular should make sense of any of this, because you will be in danger of ending up in a situation where you get one message from the Biden administration, and it's a message that you might be very happy to hear on some of these issues, and then you set yourself up for disappointment down the road when it turns out that America is not following the president in that direction. So I think the thing to watch for here will be to what extent Biden tries to set foreign policy exclusively through executive action, whether it's something like Obama's maneuver of signing the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, but never actually submitting it to the Senate as a treaty, or even on climate, whether it's a big gesture like some of the noises that the incoming Biden team are making about obstructing the Keystone XL pipeline, which might suggest various things in terms of what they're thinking on climate or energy policy. You have to contrast that kind of executive action with what he's likely to be able to get through the Congress, especially with the Senate as closely divided as it is, and the House much more closely divided than it used to be, and a bunch of moderate House members in both parties really worried about what's going to happen in 2 years. So I think I would just leave with that observation that as we continue following what the Biden team is going to do as they come in, whether you personally think it's for good or ill, I would caution people to always ask, how much consensus is there actually behind this thing that Biden is doing? Because that will tell you how much staying power it's likely to have.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph. And fifth and finally, we have Patrick Steele from Politico.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Jonathan, appreciate you including me. And I'll try and just pick up on some of the threads that the other distinguished panelists raised during their time. I actually lived in the UK in 2008, and I have a master's from UCL. And remember just the engagement across the UK and Europe with what was happening in 2008 with the US election. I suspect, while living in the US now, that that engagement was even greater around this most recent election. I would say a couple of things. I mean, it was an incredibly polarized election, but at the end of the day, Biden put together a narrow coalition. And what I always say is that the center held in the United States. It was largely a rejection of sort of the chaotic, divisive rule of President Trump, and frankly, in the United States, a rejection of very progressive policies. And so Biden was able to put together this fairly narrow coalition. And if you look at his team, especially around foreign policy, Avril Haines, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, John Kerry, Lloyd Austin. These are all people that are, many whom I know personally, but people who are deeply committed to sort of the institutions of the United States, and really deeply committed to the transatlantic alliance. And I think they understand the damage that has been done over the course of the last 4 years. And I think they will work very, very quickly to repair those alliances. And you'll almost never find a more seasoned, experienced, sort of institutionally oriented group of people, all of whom have worked for Joe Biden, by the way, for 20 years. And Biden is sort of the leader of that sort of pack of institutionalists, being a senator and vice president for the last 47 years. So an incredible team of people that trust each other, that don't need to learn how to work together and understand exactly what they need to do. But just like the campaign, whose theme was Build Back Better, right? Things have changed in the last 4 years. Our relationship with China is very different, and there is no going back to sort of what that relationship looked like 5 or 10 years ago, right? It is a completely different playing field. The one thing that I am certain of is Joe Biden is almost uniquely qualified. Even though he's 78, he'll be almost a decade older than our oldest president elected. This is somebody who, if he were 95, with a doddering on it with a cane and white hair down his back, he could walk up to the Senate and cut a deal with Mitch McConnell. I mean, this is something that he's been doing his entire life, and he's inheriting, as a few of you said, an enormous number of problems. And that the country is deeply engaged, but even more deeply divided. But Joe Biden is somebody that gave the eulogy at Strom Thurmond's funeral. I mean, this is a person who has demonstrated an ability to work across the aisle. And because they won the Senate and now control both chambers, the aperture isn't any wider in terms of what can get done, but the likelihood of something getting done, I think, goes up fairly significantly. And Joe Biden is really uniquely qualified to, sort of pull together our the United States to get some things done. And really, what I would say is, as it relates to foreign policy, what Joe Biden needs to do is we urgently need to demonstrate to our country, rather than using words to talk about how he can bring the country together and sort of going around the country talking about unity, really demonstrating the need for our government to work. And he has an opportunity to do that. And it's going to be very simple what he's going to focus on. This very large COVID relief bill that everybody in Washington believes should have gotten done, but somehow could not get done, in late 2020. Literally, people need, as my colleague John Harris says, everybody wants a needle in their arm, literally everybody. And so this is they're the non-vaxxers, but largely this is a unifying moment for him to demonstrate that the government can actually work and provide services and create jobs and get the economy moving again. And I really do believe, between the sort of COVID relief package, his commitment around infrastructure, some sort of movement on immigration that we've been talking about for 20 years, and frankly, climate, which a number of you have, that's it. Literally, that is the lane that he will operate in. And I have no idea whether or not he will succeed, but he has as good a chance as anybody in America. And that's why he won the Democratic nomination. And that's why he was elected president of the United States. And it really does, in some ways, as insane as the last 4 years have been, and especially from a vantage point of people in the UK and Europe looking at the United States, we do have the ability to demonstrate that we have a functional political center in the United States that can actually get things done. And that, in my mind, is the only way that you start bringing in sort of these disparate and deeply polarized people back towards the center. They have to see the United States moving forward. And I believe the commitment of his foreign policy team to the transatlantic alliance that has really governed American foreign policy for the last 100 years. Again, that will be part of demonstrating to the world that that was the right policy. And that is a policy where we can get things done on a global basis with our partners around the world. And I think they'll take a very similar approach domestically in the United States. So I'm an optimistic person. I am very optimistic at this moment. He's starting at a very low point. He just needs to get, focus on a small handful of things, start to move the ball forward, demonstrate to people that are, deeply polarized that the government is working again. And I think he has a chance to be a very, not necessarily transformational, but very successful president.
Excellent, Patrick. Thank you very much. I like the qualified optimism. It sounds like all of our panelists have high hopes with various degrees of hedging mixed in. And many of you have identified very real constraints in terms of political capital, just the sheer array of issues facing the Biden administration right now and many others. So we have got quite a lot of questions coming in. So I will start to choose questions and maybe direct them to a panelist where there's an obvious candidate. Maybe let's try to keep our answers relatively concise so we can get to as many questions as we can, but let's do justice to these questions. And for those of you in the audience, keep writing in and we'll get to as many as we can. Okay, so first we have Derek West, who writes, do any of the panelists think President Biden will hold China accountable for hiding COVID-19 or other behavior that violates international norms? And maybe I'll direct that question to Peter since he was the first to mention China in his remarks.
Thanks. Well, I think that Biden won't focus when it comes to China just on the virus and on the pandemic and Xi Jinping's behavior, the failure really by Beijing early in the pandemic to release information and so forth. I think it's just going to be much broader than that. I think that Beijing has been able to do a lot under the radar on human rights or pushing on Hong Kong and also in Xinjiang by taking, in a sense, advantage almost of the pandemic. So I think what I would look for is the Biden administration to adopt a broader set of policies. I should say that I don't think that means that they won't look for opportunities to cooperate with Beijing. I think we can expect that principally in the area of climate, but I think also thinking forward about viruses. I think we could probably expect some coordination and some effort to coordinate with China and others on that. So, I expect the Biden administration to go back into the WHO. I don't know that that'll be the first move, but I think that will happen. But I don't think that this is going to be a narrowly targeted approach or focus on the pandemic with respect to China.
Would anyone else? Yeah, Joseph, go ahead. Will the Biden administration hold China accountable on COVID-19 or other transgressions?
Okay, well, on China, I actually see a big danger here or a potential pitfall for the Biden administration, and it has to do with climate, actually. I think that the big potential issue that we can run into here, especially with John Kerry's appointment as a special ambassador for climate, which signifies how seriously the Biden administration is going to take this, is that you end up in a situation where Kerry has gone to Beijing and has extracted some kind of concessions on environmental or climate matters from China. Probably, if we're frank, an agreement that the government in Beijing would not end up paying undue attention to following at the end of the day. And then in exchange for that kind of agreement, you end up getting some sort of forbearance from Washington on some of these other issues that are complicating the relationship. And this is not conceptually different from what Trump did. It's just that for Trump, it was various nonsensical concessions on trade issues that Beijing didn't really have much of an intention to follow through on. And so to the extent that you would often have Trump soft peddling some of the human rights stuff, it was because he falsely thought that he was getting progress on the trade front. I do have some concern that we would end up in the same kind of situation in the Biden administration, except their kind of the issue at the center of it is going to be climate change and some sort of carbon emissions issues or other things instead of the trade.
Excellent, thank you. Anyone else on this question? I mean, this is a somewhat central core issue for the Biden administration, or should we move on? Leslie, please.
I might just say something really quickly. I mean, I have heard this argument. I think I'm glad that that Joseph put it out there. I have a hard time imagining this. I mean, when I look at the climate proposals from the Biden teams, obviously there's an international agenda, but the domestic agenda is really the big one, right? It's re-regulating the deregulation across the agencies on the environmental side. It's a spending package that's focused on job creation in low-income communities that is targeted at clean jobs, green jobs, and I find it almost impossible to imagine that we're going to see people like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan say, "Oh, they gave us a little bit on climate, and we know that they don't always comply." Right? Words are cheap, and so therefore we're not going to worry about technology or trade or human rights. I find it inconceivable. Actually, I would say that. But I do agree that you highlight the core challenge, which is, how do you move forward these sort of twin tracks of wanting to cooperate on the big, global health and climate while taking a really tough line on market access and technology and IP. And I haven't heard a good answer to that yet, other than we need to have separate tracks and we need to keep going and we'll deal with it when we get there. But I think we'll see a very different trade calculation about that trade-off than we saw under Trump's leadership, or if we can call it Trump's leadership on this.
Joseph, do you want to reply on that, and then we'll move on?
Well, I absolutely take Leslie's point that, especially on climate issues, a lot of the discussion about that in the new administration is going to be domestic focused on the U.S. economy. But I guess the note of caution that I can't get myself away from on this is the fact that precisely because it will be such a potent political issue domestically, the temptation to try to put one in the win column in terms of the China relationship is that much stronger. So, I mean, it's not necessarily that I think that, experienced foreign policy hands like Blinken or Sullivan are going to get completely snowed by this. But I think that if you're a political advisor to Biden and you're sitting there with him in the Oval Office thinking, well, how are we going to pitch various of these things domestically? I think there will be that very strong temptation to really perhaps overplay or overhype any signs of Chinese cooperation on that they get.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, the next question I want to ask is from a younger member of the audience. This is from Sam Dixon, who is a sixth form college student. Is that a high school student, a sixth form college student? And this is not strictly a foreign policy question, but I think for our global audience who is interested in cultural divisions within the United States, what is going on in the US? This is an interesting question. His question is, quote, for Patrick, What does the uproar in response to Ben Shapiro writing an issue of your playbook say about the cultural divisions in the USA, Sam, sixth form college?
Can you just repeat the question again?
This one is for you. This one is for you. What does the uproar in response to Ben Shapiro writing an issue of your playbook say about the cultural divisions in the United States?
I mean, it says that we're deeply divided, and there's not a monolithic sort of view about Ben Shapiro. Everybody has, deeply opposing views, and I mean, frankly, the media space. I mean, I run a business, right? At the end of the day, and I have a strategy. My strategy is the narrow middle, speaking to influentials in government and politics that sort of are part of that, what I described as the functional political center of the United States. That's my business model. But if you're Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, right, you've seen those organizations, as well as many of our sort of national digital publications, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. They've all moved in response to the deeply polarized sort of environment that we find ourselves into. And to me, that is that's a monumental problem that I don't have any, simple solution to. I have a strategy that has turned Politico into a hugely successful business because there's literally nobody in the center. But the fact that if you're going to, and again, this is going to be a little US centric, but if you're going to MSNBC or Fox to get your information, you're non-persuadable. Everything that you read reinforces what you already believe. And I think, and so to get back to the question, when, when people see opposing views and, Shapiro's a particularly complicated individual because he's made statements that are very controversial. It's people are they're just not willing to engage with that kind of commentary, and I think it's a huge problem for the United States. I don't think it's unique to the United States, but media companies are chasing that enormous polarized scale, and they're finding great success doing it, and it has the effect of just reinforcing for many of those people on the polarized left and right what they already believe. And so getting back to that, that functional political center becomes even more difficult.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, next is from John Newham, who asks, quote, how will the Biden administration approach North Korea? And to what extent will this affect attitudes towards China? Maybe Kelly, could I direct this from you? You had mentioned North Korea, your remarks.
I have to say, I'm not sure. I have to imagine it will be however the Biden administration decides to proceed, it will not be wholly divorced from the U.S. approach towards China for obvious reasons. I can also say, I think unequivocally, that the Biden administration's approach to North Korea will be rather different than the Trump administration's rocket man, fire and fury, rather unproductive approach towards North Korea. I do think, as has already been mentioned a few times, we're not in the same place that, the world's not in the same place, and the US is not in the same place as it was 4 years ago, 8 years ago. So the idea that we're going to pick up and reinvigorate negotiations with North Korea over its nuclear program in a way that, people could criticize it before, but it might have been conceivable back in the day. I don't think we're at that place now, and North Korea certainly doesn't view itself at that same place. Now, it is interesting. Kim gave a speech just a few days ago, I think, whereby he acknowledged that there were some problems domestically in a way that I think is a bit different than what we've seen recently. Acknowledging that he's failed, right, in some ways domestically, and that could provide an opening. I also, consistent with Patrick, would say, if there's a team who can reinvigorate the relationship or find a way forward, the Biden administration has that team. Exactly what this is going to look like, I'm not sure, and I don't think it's as high a priority as some people might like it to be, given the extraordinary number of very pressing, acute challenges facing the Biden administration. But would the Biden administration like to see progress made, sort of getting back to the table with the North Koreans? I would be unsurprised. I just think it's probably, to say it's on the back burner is fair in light of all of the other challenges facing.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, moving right along, there's another question I like. This is from Philip McGloin, who asks, quote, how much of a challenge does Trump pose to the Biden administration and political stability post-presidency? Is his news network a feasible outcome? Where does he fall on the spectrum between Rush Limbaugh and Jefferson Davis? All right, maybe, can I give this one to Joseph?
Oh, okay.
I mean, if anyone has a view on this, feel free, but I think from a US point of view, maybe you have the best insight into this.
Well, I mean, if there is even the faintest, tiniest sliver of a silver lining from the total disaster of the past 2 weeks in the US, starting on January 6th, I think that it will turn out to be that Trump has completely spent himself as a political force. Do I wish that there could have been just about any other way to get to that point? Of course I do. But that is the world that we're living in right now. So I think that in that sense, and I mean, not just what happened with the riot on Capitol Hill, but also the whole discreditable 2 months leading up to that, I think have not been good in terms of Trump's future moving forward and his ability to command the respect or any kind of allegiance from the large number of Republicans who I think voted for him without harboring any great personal affection for him. So, I mean, from that perspective, in an odd sort of way, I think that Biden is coming in a situation where he might even have a cleaner slate than some new presidents have, just because his predecessor has very deliberately chosen not to go out on a high note. And I think that will extend to some of these issues, like the potential of a Trump news network that the questioner raised in terms of Trump's ability to perpetuate his influence. I mean, I don't know how he would pay for a venture like that now. I don't know where the funding would come from at this point. And I don't know which of the large networks would be particularly eager to have him on much of the time anymore. So I think that, that is, very much an unintended benefit, but a benefit for the Biden team coming in.
Thank you. Peter, you have a take on this?
Well, I would say, first of all, I hope Joe is right about Trump being a spent political force. I think the larger question here is how the Republican Party, if and how it decides to reimagine itself. I mean, to what extent do Republicans put distance on Capitol Hill, put distance between themselves and Trump and that segment of the Republican voting public that is pretty aligned with Trump? I know that it shrunk, and we can see that in the polls, but it's still quite considerable. Now, those Republicans may get a chance if Nancy Pelosi actually sends the article of impeachment forward and the Democrats really decide to push this. And then I think, we see like where McConnell comes down. And I think this helps determine the extent to which Trump has traction going forward, or Trump wannabes have traction going forward. So, if Trump is cut off without access to a platform like Twitter and so forth, I agree that it makes him less of a force. But until we really see Republicans start moving and putting daylight between themselves and Trumpism, I'm not that reassured.
Peter, I would note that since we've been online, McConnell has publicly announced that the insurrection was provoked by the president.
That's a very—
That is breaking news just 5 minutes ago.
Right.
A data point for Joseph. Yeah, Leslie, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, that's very interesting because that also suggests to me that who knows, right? This is like where we're sort of grabbing at the future. But we need the future really badly, and we need tomorrow very badly. But this suggests to me that Nancy Pelosi will move forward because that's been the $100,000 question. I think we've all assumed that she'll move forward. It's a question of when, but that suggests to me that they're going to move forward fast. And, we've all had a big debate about whether this is a good idea and also what the impact will be. But I think to Peter's point, if Mitch McConnell's making that comment, if they move forward, this could be the wedge that really pushes, the extreme part of the Republican Party, really does what kind of Joseph is saying. It really fully marginalizes and condemns. Maybe you're not saying that, but I am saying that, right? I think it could be potentially, right? It could be if Mitch McConnell's behind it. The big story alongside the American Recovery Plan getting, a substantial part of that getting passed, which is the sign of a functional government. And my read on, most Americans, including many Americans in the white working class demographic, is that more than anything else, they want a government that functions. And most of them do want that shot in the arm. So the politics of this is highly dynamic right now. I mean, the fluidity and the dynamism of the next couple of weeks, I think it's quite hard to understate in terms of alignments in the Republican Party. Kelly's kind of, going, yeah. So it just strikes me as an incredibly interesting time that it's a little bit unpredictable because there is a sort of who moves and who moves behind them question.
Peter, do you want to come back on this?
No, actually, I'm assuming that Patrick's phone has lit up in these past couple of minutes. So I would actually be interested in hearing his take, because if McConnell does move, and if this is a signal that he is prepared to convict, okay, there's a jump here. Yeah. But I mean, if McConnell lays his body down, you get the 17, I suspect, in the Senate. It makes it possible for 17 to cross over. And then I think, Joe, then your scenario really does work.
All right. Patrick, do you want to comment on this?
I think let's get till tomorrow. I think Washington is going to feel very different tomorrow, frankly. It's hard to predict what the next few weeks will look like. Obviously, if McConnell is going to vote to convict, that will, I don't know if it's 17 votes. Frankly, the establishment Republican Party does not control Donald Trump, nor his followers, nor millions and millions of people that voted for him. But I think that would be a material development. There's no question about it. I think the bigger question about Trump is, clearly he's leaving office with the country in shambles and at a diminished moment in his sort of, political career and impact. But, again, he came 41,000 votes away in 3 states from being reelected president. I mean, we've got to keep that, sort of at least in the back of our mind. I mean, even though Biden won the popular vote by a decent margin, he really came very, very close to getting reelected in the middle of a pandemic that he had badly mismanaged, with 10% unemployment and a lot of other forces that nobody thought he should have even been remotely close. And so to say that he won't have some impact, whether it's Trump or Trumpism, I think is, I'm not there. I'm not there. And the fact that only 10 Republicans voted to impeach him, even though it was a rushed process, that, and people were thinking that number could be 20 or, 24. I think that tells you a lot, at least about whether it's Trump or Trumpism, the impact that he's had on the party. And I don't see that changing immediately.
Okay. Leslie.
Just one comment. When I think it's every time I hear this, I just want to keep saying it. The Democrats made some big mistakes in winning people that could have been moved on defund the police and that socialist agenda. And I don't think we can't assume that people that voted for Trump did it because they loved him. Some of them did it because they really, really didn't like what they were seeing coming out of the Democrats. I'm not saying that that's how I feel or that's right or wrong, but that is how, it was very successfully portrayed as, wow, they've gone off the rails. They're going to get rid of our police. They're going to get rid of money. They're going to quote, how many times have we heard it? They're going to give everything away for free. So what does Biden do, right? So much of this is not just, it's what does Biden do to speak to that? Does he manage to bring back the mainstream of white American working and middle class people alongside the racial justice agenda and, bring us out of economic recovery? And I mean, it's a big agenda, but I think that it's as much about what the Democrats have and haven't done as it is about the Republicans in my.
Thank you. All right, Kelly, you're breaking news here. This is great. If you have anything else, let us know. Okay.
Well, I guess if you're offering me the mic, just very quickly, building on what Leslie was saying and tying some of the other points together, it's not simply that the Democrats made some big mistakes, which they did, but also how those mistakes were portrayed and amplified and also misrepresented in the context of these echo chambers. So if one is leaning towards voting towards Trump or open to voting towards Trump, or simply if Fox is your go-to news source, defund the police, as awful as the slogan was, actually sounded even a whole lot worse. And so what was promised as filtered through Fox was even more threatening, far more threatening than what was actually on offer from the Dems. So until we break out of the echo chambers or find a way to reinstall gatekeepers in the, not to belabor too many metaphors, but those horses may have left the barn. So we need some concrete achievements. This has already been said, but we need, so you need to get buy-in from people who distrust. And not to be a broken record, but I started here. And so in some sense, I feel a little bit funny that I'm deeply divided here in that the optimistic part of my brain was started where with Patrick's initial remarks, it's like, yes, I would like to believe we're turning a corner. And to align with what Joseph said, weirdly, I think January 6th brought us to a place we were going to get to anyway, but it kind of catalyzed it much more quickly and enabled deplatforming a number of things that we would have had a Trump channel if not for January 6th. So not applauding it, but things were and remain quite divided, situation's quite complicated, it's quite fraught, but at least there's an opening and there's movement. So the optimistic part of my brain was with Patrick. And then interestingly, Patrick's last comments were sort of where I started out, doom and gloom and pessimist. So maybe, I don't want to put words in Patrick's mouth, but he too may be wrestling with the, there's enormous possibility, but there's also enormous pitfalls. And I'm tremendously worried, as was obvious from my initial comments, but also Biden is the right man to be in this job right now. And he's assembled a great team and they're highly qualified. There are grownups back in the room. And so if anybody could do it, this team can, but this is a rough one. And it's not helped by the fact that when people say there are two separate sets of facts, there's not facts and altered facts, there's facts, but how they're interpreted and presented and filtered matters immensely. And until we can get out of that multiple presentations of facts, even real achievements are not going to be seen as real achievements. And I would love for the journalists to tell me why I'm wrong and how we can get past this. So that's, I guess, a question to some of the panelists by me.
I go back to needles and arms, infrastructure, jobs. then try and figure out how to unify the country. I mean, that to me, that's the only path forward. Trying to just, words will do nothing at this point. I mean, it's you know, people are, they're just so far apart. You have to, you need small wins, needles and arms, some new jobs, and then you can start demonstrating you know, to the American people that there's a competent team in town, and they're doing what's in the best interest of everybody. That's, to me, that's the only way forward.
Peter, I sense that you're a little bit more pessimistic than that.
No, what I want to say is what this conversation has really underscored is the focus is going to be domestic. You know, I take Joe's point, events, there's stuff that's going to happen internationally. We could all be talking about North Korea a few days from now, because dear leader, Joe Biden's not going to be sending him love letters, and dear leader is going to do whatever he does, and he might really mix things up in a way that forces the Biden administration to invest time and energy there in a way that it would prefer not to. But I think, you know, what this conversation, it seems to me, just really, really underscores is how much attention and energy and political capital is going to be absorbed domestically.
Excellent. All right. Let's get to another question here. This is from Alana McLaren, who is a student at King's College London. And she asks, quote, what sort of foreign policy objectives do you see being promoted by the return of veteran diplomats and advisors such as William Burns, Avril Haines, and Antony Blinken? Maybe Leslie, you sort of touched on this question of how much daylight there was between Biden and Obama, and a little bit about his foreign policy team. What does this signal to you?
I mean, I don't want to overplay the daylight, and obviously many of the characters are the same. But I think Obama himself had a different set of objectives. But let me, which were much more realist, right, and much more restrained. But let me talk, I guess, say a little bit about that. You know, that I think some of the is a great question. So whoever asked that, and it's great to hear the questions from people who are in the best place possible, which is full-time engaged and thinking about, you know, the world at one of the best universities in the world. So great question. You know, Tony Blinken, I think we've seen, right, that and across that range, the commitment to multilateralism, the deep experience, the focus on democracy and human rights. And I guess I want to tie it back to the North Korea question, which is one of the questions for me on North Korea. I mean, I think it's true we're not going to see, you know, negotiations without a certain set of conditions met, which are unlikely to be met quickly. But one of the big questions for me, given that Tony Blinken's in post and Jake Sullivan's in post, is will they raise the human rights question with respect to North Korea? Now, historically, you know, the human rights conversation has been sidelined in order to try and make some progress on the nuclear question. And the one time when that was not the case was in around 2014. The UN Commission of Inquiry put out its huge report on the human rights abuses in North Korea. And because the nuclear community, this is my understanding, having talked to quite a lot of people about it, because they were so sure that there was just no progress to be made, they were willing to kind of bring together the pressure on all angles, and they played the human rights card quite hard for a limited period of time. The danger in doing that is that you're potentially walking yourself in, you know, back into a corner where your only real strategy is to wait out that regime and have it go, because unless you believe that that regime is actually going to reform and play by the rules of the international community, where do you go when you start calling them out for their rather extraordinarily atrocious degree of human rights? So all that's to say that, you know, with the Blinken and Sullivan team and Avril Haines, who I know less well, you know, one of the questions for me is they're very committed. Their values are up front, their experience is up front, but they are going to face pragmatic choices and trade-offs, and that will be the interesting question. What do they do? And, you know, this was raised earlier on the panel with the question of climate in China. What do they do when actually putting that human rights card up front and the democracy card up front gets in the way of a particular negotiation? And, you know, so far they're really willing to play the card. Yemen, Russia, China, Hong Kong, Ethiopia, you name it, it's on the Twitter feed. So we'll see.
All right, well, let's see. On a completely different potential crisis, here's a question from Tahira Amini, who asks, Alexei Navalny's arrest in Russia has been condemned by Biden. Is this something that Biden will continue, as Russia has also infringed upon the rights of its citizens? Okay, so Russia, and we have this one particular issue that's put Russia back on the agenda. What do we think of the Navalny case particularly, but Russia in general?
So I would actually answer that by also kind of circling back to the previous question too, because I think that this kind of illustrates an interesting dynamic where having such an experienced team can sometimes be a double-edged sword, because I do think, and this is not a phrase that I often find myself saying, you do have to give the Trump administration some credit for the foreign policy victories that they did manage to rack up. I think that, one of those victories has, and of course, Trump didn't actually intend for this, but I think that there is now somewhat more of a consensus within Washington that Russia is a, security issue that the U.S. needs to take seriously. I think there's now more of an understanding than there was before Trump, even though Trump himself is not part of that consensus. I think that, there have been some of these other areas where you tended to, I think the Abraham Accords in the Middle East are another instance where the Biden administration is inheriting a big success that people would not necessarily have thought was possible before it actually happened. And so I think that part of the challenge for the Biden team, and this also will have to do with some of their approach to what they actually do about that consensus on Russia now, is to actually take a step back, accurately survey the landscape, figure out what are the good things that we are inheriting, and how can we build on that. So I think that potentially argues for maybe some rethinking of what had been the more traditional approach to Middle East questions. In Russia, it's worth asking. Some of Biden's advisors seem to be very enthusiastic about things like arms control and using arms control negotiations as a big vector for engagement with Russia. But it's worth asking, when you have events like Navalny and the kind of popular opposition to Putin's regime that Navalny represents, is then kind of going back to the table and doing an arms control negotiation the right expenditure of Biden's energies? Or are there different ways now where the world has moved on and potentially opened up different avenues for engagement that we should be thinking about? And is maybe more of a focus on some of these human rights issues and less of a focus on some of the very technical arms control negotiations, the sort of thing that we need to be focusing on?
Excellent. Okay. Another topic. This is also from Tahira, who is a sixth form student, a high school student. And another important topic she asks, she's wondering, oh wait, it disappeared. Here we go. She's wondering, quote, whether Biden will be a better president to do a trade deal with for Brexit compared to Trump. Okay, so what does Biden mean for a potential US-UK trade deal following Brexit? Anyone want to jump in on this one?
You go, Joseph, and then I'll agree with you. Go ahead.
Okay. I actually don't think that Biden is going to change that much in terms of the potential for a US-UK trade deal, because again, this is one of those issues where, separate out all of the light and, often without an awful lot of heat that we would get from the Trump administration on trade. The actual issues that have been the sticking points so far, I mean, whether it's things like pharmaceutical procurement or, agricultural and food safety issues, or, financial services and the divergent financial services regulations in both countries, those have always been US priorities in trade negotiations. They were priorities for the US before Trump. They were priorities during Trump. They will be priorities after Trump. Those represent domestic interests within the US that you need to tick off if you're going to do a trade deal. So I actually don't think that, I mean, there's been this theory you hear sometimes that Biden would have been, worse for a Brexit deal because he was less enthusiastic about Brexit than Trump had been. I'm not sure that that's true, but I also don't think that Biden is going to be any better for a deal.
Peter?
Geez, I thought I was going to be able to agree with Joe. So, I mean, if the question is a UK-US trade deal, I mean, it's possible down the road, but it seems to me that I don't see why Biden would invest precious political capital in this kind of a trade deal with the UK in the near term. If he's going to do that, Joe, I would think you go back into TPP, you find a way, or you revisit TTIP. If you're going to assume the cost, why not get bigger benefits out of it and so forth? Having said that, I mean, I think there's room for Biden and Johnson to cooperate on issues that might ultimately pave the way to a trade deal. And I think Johnson just has to be patient over climate, over China, over human rights, and perhaps the G7 and the UN climate summit that Johnson will be hosting in the UK later this year will provide an opportunity to begin to reset the table so that you can ultimately get to a trade deal. But it just seems to me that that would not be, I just would think that the US trade representative would be saying, let's not, if we're going to do something, let's not do it there. Let's go big. Let's bring labor in. Let's kind of figure out a way to make this thing really work for people in the US. Could be wrong, but Kelly's going to tell us that there's breaking news.
Exactly. The deal's done. Joseph, go ahead.
Well, I would just say, actually, Peter, I think you and I are agreeing with each other more than you might think, because I guess the point I was trying to get across is, I mean, these things that have emerged as sticking points in these trade talks, whether it's these infernal chlorinated chickens or any of the financial services or pharmaceutical procurement, those are issues in these talks because they are very important to big domestic political constituencies in the US. So you can kind of see a deal if Boris Johnson wakes up tomorrow morning and decides, you know what, it is so important that we do this deal that we are prepared to accede to all of these big US priorities just for the sake of getting the deal done, and then I'll figure out how to sell that in the UK. Since that scenario is not particularly likely, and these domestic interests in the US are not going away, I would completely agree with you that I don't see Biden wanting to expend any of his precious political capital persuading, Americans domestically to accept big concessions on any of this stuff, or to make big concessions in service of getting a US-UK deal.
Any other comments on a US-UK trade deal? Leslie, please. Yeah.
One very quick comment. I agree with these last two comments. I don't think it's going to be front of the queue. The question is, how does the Johnson administration manage that without looking like they've lost something? Mm-hmm. And I would say, the mistake that they made, given that, if I understand right, having read Robin Niblett's very important piece, if you haven't seen it, take a look at the paper on British foreign policy, that he has a section where he talks about this. And, it's not a big gain in terms of GDP for the UK, this US-UK free trade deal. It's just been made such a big thing, right? The symbolic walk back of not getting it, unfortunately, I think could be quite big for the Johnson administration. So what a mistake it was to put so much emphasis on it when you can't be sure you're going to get it. And so how does the US help them walk that back? So I think we might see a lot of, the obvious thing to do would be to keep saying it's going to happen and then kick the can down the road. While you do some other deals and put priorities elsewhere.
Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Just to follow on to Leslie's point, I think I agree, and maybe to change what he needs to do is change the conversation and find areas where he can agree with the Biden administration and where the Biden administration will find agreement with the UK useful in dealing with the European allies, i.e. China, it seems to me, and perhaps on, like Chinese investment and on human rights as maybe some potential leverage for the Biden administration.
Okay, we are running out of time, but I want to make sure we get to one last question. I really like that we are getting questions from younger members of the audience. This is from Paul Taggart, who is a student at Sacred Heart Grammar School, which, if I understand this is an elementary school. And Paul, is that right? Or is this also a high school student? Yeah. So he writes, what role, if any, will the Republican Party play in shaping foreign policy in the next 2 to 4 years? Will they attempt to damage Biden, or will they be interested in genuine cooperation? From Paul Taggart at Sacred Heart Grammar.
I'm happy to take it. I think practically their influence in foreign policy will be very limited with, sort of a Biden-controlled government and Senate and House. I do think, depending on what trade deals get cut early on, you can expect that there'll be major critics, if those deals don't play out exactly as expected. But I don't. I mean, I think he's got a very good team, a very knowledgeable team. They've all worked together. I think they know exactly sort of what their plan is. You're always going to get curveballs. North Korea, lots of things could happen. But I suspect Biden is going to have very, very strong control of our foreign policy over the next 2 to 4 years.
Any final comments on this, the prospects for real bipartisan action? Yeah, Joseph.
I would just say I think it is ultimately going to depend on what Biden wants to do and how he wants to do it, because I think that on some of these foreign policy issues we've talked about, especially on things like human rights in China or Russia, he would be able to get bipartisan consensus behind that action, because you already have Republicans in both the House and the Senate who are very interested in these issues. And that, if I were giving Biden political advice, and I don't know why he would ask me, but if he did, I would suggest look for some of those foreign policy areas where there already is this agreement that he can tap into. I think that if he instead decides to invest a lot of his capital in issues like climate or reviving the Iran nuclear deal much as it existed in 2015, he's going to have a much harder road getting Republicans on board with that.
Peter.
Well, I realize that we're out of time here, and I don't disagree with what's been said. I suppose the larger question is where Republicans really decide what issues they decide to focus on. I would broaden it, because they may decide, look, they're going to need to figure out a way. McConnell is going to need to figure out a way to try to unify the caucus. What are the set of issues that this is going to be done around? So, is it over regulatory policy or trade policy or, infrastructure? It's unclear to me right now, but they're going to need something to push back very hard on to try to bring some unity to the caucus. And it may be the smart move by Biden is, to the extent that he pushes on China, that is something that will draw in Republicans, it seems to me. But there's just such a raft of issues that they can go after I just think that it will be, I think McConnell is going to have his hands full trying to figure out exactly what set of issues pulls the party together, and to the extent he wants to pull it away to go down, Joe's path away from Trump, which issues will do that to refocus the Republicans.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to bring things to a close. We're out of time, so let me thank all of our panelists for an outstanding discussion, and let me thank everyone in our audience for tuning in, for writing in questions. if you are interested in US politics and foreign policy, all of our panelists are doing great writing, or they are running or part of centers that are doing great events on US politics and foreign policy, including the UCL Center for US Politics. So keep looking us up. And I think that's it. So I want to thank UCL. I want to thank Leslie at Chatham House, as well as the US Embassy, for all of their support in sponsoring these events. And thank you all for tuning in. And I think we're going to have to bring things to a close. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Great to be with you. Thank you very much. Good to be with everybody.